Welcome. This first lecture lays the foundation for everything that follows. Measure theory, the language in which modern probability and integration are written. And it opens with a question that sounds simple but reshapes the whole subject. Before we can measure the size of anything, or integrate any function, we first have to decide which sets can be measured at all. That single decision is what we build in this lecture, step by step. Here is the plan. We will build this in 3 movements. First, the structures. Which sets can be measured, through the sigma-algebras, and which functions respect that structure. Then the measures themselves. How to assign a size, and the central technical engine of the chapter. How to extend a size defined on a few simple sets to all the measurable ones. And finally, the concrete payoff, distribution functions and the Lebesgue measure, the reference measure used throughout the rest of the book. Before any technical tool, the guiding idea. Measure theory is what lets us assign a size, a measure to the subsets of an abstract space. And through that, an integral to the functions defined on it. The whole chapter turns on one ordering. First decide which sets can be measured, and only then which functions and which measures can live on top of them. This is the opening chapter of the book, Measure Theory, Probability and Stochastic Processes, an integrated approach. Measure theory is the rigorous framework beneath modern probability, integration, and functional analysis, and its task here is precise: to make sense of the size, the measure, of the subsets of an abstract space, and through that, of the integral of the functions defined on it. The road runs from the measurability of sets, to the measurability of functions, to the construction and extension of measures, and ends at the Lebesgue measure, our reference throughout the book. One convention is fixed before anything else. Numbers here are allowed to be infinite, so we settle the arithmetic of the extended reals and the extended complexes at the very outset. We start with a language, a short section that fixes notation and, above all, the arithmetic of numbers that may be infinite, the conventions that keep every later computation unambiguous. A handful of symbols we will use constantly, an arbitrary underlying set and its power set, the collection of all its subsets, together with the families of subsets we single out from it, and the small grammar of the subject, the symbols for a constant function, for a definition, and for the such that of set builder notation. Nothing deep here, just the vocabulary that lets everything later be written cleanly. One last piece of vocabulary we will rely on: Euclidean space. Simply r to the m, with its usual notion of distance, whose topology does not depend on the norm we choose. Here we make infinity a legitimate value. The extended reals add plus and minus infinity to the line, and the only forbidden operation is adding plus infinity to minus infinity. Every other combination is given a definite meaning, including the convention that 0 times infinity is 0, which will matter constantly in integration. The extended complex numbers are built the same way, but at a price the slide states plainly. They form neither a field nor a ring, because multiplication is only partially defined. Convergence remains the usual notion, simply allowing the terms to be infinite. Now the first real structure. Which collections of sets are rich enough to carry a measure? The answer is the sigma-algebra, and this section builds it, from finite operations up to countable ones, and identifies the measurable sets it contains. We begin with the simplest such structure, an algebra of sets. The idea is that a family of subsets should be closed under the basic logical operations performed finitely many times, complement and finite unions, and therefore finite intersections too. The slide gives the precise axioms and a concrete example on the real line, where the finite unions of disjoint intervals form exactly such an algebra. The sigma-algebra is the decisive upgrade. It asks for the same closure properties, but now under countably many operations, not just finitely many. And that single step, from finite to countable, is what will later let a measure interact with limits. A set equipped with a sigma-algebra is a measurable space, the stage for everything that follows. The 2 extreme cases on the slide, the trivial family and the full power set, frame the whole range that lies between them. In practice, we almost never write a sigma-algebra down directly. Instead, we start from some family of sets we care about, and take the smallest sigma-algebra containing it, the one it generates. 2 simple facts make this usable. A larger starting family generates a larger sigma-algebra, and when the starting family can be taken countable, the result is called countably generated. This generation idea is the usual way we describe a concrete sigma algebra. Two constructions here, and the second is the one we will lean on most. The trace lemma says just this: restricting then generating, or generating then restricting, gives the same result. The definition that really matters is the Borel sigma algebra. On any topological space, the one generated by the open sets. It is the default measurable structure on every space that carries a notion of nearness, and it will accompany us for the rest of the book. To handle several spaces at once, we need a measurable structure on their product. It is generated by the boxes, products of measurable pieces, one per factor. The natural question is whether this product structure agrees with the Borel structure of the product space, and the lemma gives the clean answer. One always contains the other, and they coincide as soon as each factor is second countable. A mild condition, satisfied by most of the spaces we actually use. On the spaces we compute with Euclidean, complex, and their extended versions, the Borel structure has a very concrete description. It is generated by rectangles. And reassuringly, it makes no difference whether we take those rectangles open, closed, or half open. They all generate the same sigma algebra. The same picture carries over, coordinate by coordinate, to the complex spaces and to the extended spaces where infinite values are allowed. With the sets in place, we turn to functions. A function is measurable when it respects the measurable structure, when the preimage of a measurable set is again measurable. This section makes that precise, and shows how robust the notion turns out to be. Here's the central definition. A function is measurable when the preimage of every measurable set is itself measurable. A principle exactly analogous to continuity, where we replace open sets with measurable ones. Rather than verify this for all such sets, the generating class theorem lets us restrict to a family that generates the target structure. Finally, for functions valued in a Euclidean or complex space, measurability can be checked one real coordinate at a time. Two results that already cover a great many of the functions we will meet. Every continuous function between Euclidean spaces is measurable, and every monotone function on an interval is measurable. Between them, they give us a large supply of measurable functions to build on. Measurability is also stable under the operations we constantly perform. Composing two measurable maps gives a measurable map. Composing a measurable function with a continuous one does too. And the usual algebra, sums, products, scalar multiples, and quotients where they make sense, keeps functions measurable. So once the building blocks are measurable, everything we assemble from them stays measurable. And here is a decisive property: measurability survives limits. For a sequence of measurable functions, the lower and upper limits are measurable, and so is the pointwise limit wherever it exists. This is precisely where the countable closure of the sigma algebra pays off. Limits of measurable functions are again measurable, which is what later lets integration interact smoothly with limits. Simple functions are the elementary bricks of integration. Finite combinations of indicators of measurable sets, taking only finitely many values. The key result is the simple approximation theorem. Every non-negative measurable function is the increasing pointwise limit of such simple functions. That is the bridge to the integral. Define it first on the simple bricks, then pass to the limit. The next slide shows this approximation in action. The figure makes the construction visible. On the left, a coarse approximation, only a few levels, and the staircase sits well below the curve. On the right, a finer one. As we add levels, the staircase climbs and hugs the curve from underneath. The picture shows the essential feature. The approximation always stays below the target and rises steadily toward it, never overshooting. Here the function is drawn on the real line for clarity, but the result itself holds on any abstract space. Semi-continuity is a weaker form of continuity. Where a continuous function must approach its value at a point from both above and below, a semi-continuous function only has to respect a bound on one side of that value. The slide gives the precise definitions and their clean characterization through level sets being open. The point we carry forward is the last one. A lower or upper semi-continuous function is automatically measurable, which hands us yet another large, easily recognized supply of measurable functions. This theorem is one of the most useful tools in the whole subject, even if its statement looks technical. The idea is a bootstrapping principle. If a class of non-negative functions contains the constants and the indicators of a pi system, a family closed under finite intersections, and is stable under the right linear operations and under increasing limits, then it must contain every measurable function. In practice, we verify a property on simple indicators and let the theorem carry it to all measurable functions at once. The remark flags the one subtlety that makes the machine run. The linear step must be restricted to bounded functions, with the unbounded case carried by the limiting step. We now reach the measures themselves. First, what a measure is and how it behaves. Then the central technical question of the chapter: how to take a size defined only on a few simple sets and extend it, uniquely, to the whole sigma algebra. A measure is the formal notion of size, a set function that is zero on the empty set and adds up over countable disjoint families. Countable additivity is the heart of it. That is what separates a measure from a merely finitely additive size. From it follow the two basic properties on the slide. A measure is monotone, so larger sets carry larger measure, and countably subadditive, even when the pieces overlap. Measures come in a few standard sizes: finite, the special case of total mass 1, which is a probability measure, and the more flexible sigma-finite, where the whole space is a countable union of finite measure pieces. Sigma-finiteness is the one to keep in mind, because it is exactly the condition that will guarantee uniqueness in a moment. The slide gives the canonical examples: the Dirac measure, a unit mass sitting at a single point, and the counting measure, which simply counts elements. Measures behave continuously along monotone sequences of sets. For an increasing sequence, the measure of the union is the limit of the measures, with no restriction at all. For a decreasing sequence, the same holds, but only under one hypothesis. At least one of the sets must have finite measure. That finiteness condition is no technicality, and the next slide shows exactly why it cannot be dropped. The lemma adds that measures can be summed. A countable sum of measures is again a measure. Two pictures, side by side, settle the question. On the left, a decreasing sequence of intervals shrinking down to a single point. Each has finite length. The lengths fall to zero, and the limit matches the measure of the point. Continuity from above works. On the right, a decreasing sequence of half-lines marching off to infinity. They too shrink down to nothing, yet each one has infinite length, so the measures stay infinite and never approach zero. The sets close in on an empty intersection, but the measures refuse to follow. That single divergent example is the whole reason the finiteness hypothesis cannot be removed. Before extending a measure, we have to make sense of one defined on a family of sets that is not yet a sigma-algebra. The definition is the natural one: zero on the empty set, and additive over countable disjoint unions, whenever the union still belongs to the family. Sigma-finiteness is then defined relative to such a family. The space is exhausted by countably many sets of finite measure drawn from it. This is the modest starting data from which the full measure will be built. This is the keystone of the chapter. A measure defined only on an algebra of sets always extends to a measure on the sigma-algebra it generates, that is existence. And when the measure is sigma-finite, that extension is unique. Together, existence and uniqueness mean that we can prescribe a measure on a small, manageable family of sets, and be certain it determines one and only one measure on everything generated from them. The construction of the Lebesgue measure, in particular, rests on this result. Often the natural starting family is even smaller than an algebra. It is a semiring. The example to keep in mind is the one on the real line, the half-open intervals, which form precisely the semiring underlying the Lebesgue measure. The extension theorem then does its work from this minimal data. A size on the semiring that is finitely additive and countably subadditive extends to a genuine measure on the generated sigma algebra. This is the exact mechanism we use next to construct the Lebesgue measure itself. The final section brings everything down to the real line. We connect measures with distribution functions, the bridge toward probability, and from there construct the Lebesgue measure, the reference measure used throughout the rest of the book. Here is one of the most important correspondences in the subject. On the line, locally finite measures and cumulative distribution functions are two faces of the same object. Every such measure produces a distribution function, non-decreasing, right continuous, with a left-hand limit at every point. And conversely, every distribution function comes from one and only one locally finite measure, the Lebesgue-Stieltjes measure. This dictionary between measures and distribution functions is exactly what will let us speak of probability in measure-theoretic terms later on. This figure shows the correspondence at a glance. On the left, a continuous distribution function. The mass is spread out, and the measure of an interval is simply the rise of the function across it. On the right, a distribution function with a jump at a point. That jump is not lost. It becomes a concentrated mass sitting exactly at that point. The size of the mass is the height of the jump, the gap between the value of the function and its left-hand limit there. A continuous distribution function has no such jumps, and so carries no concentrated point mass at all. Now the language of the negligible. A set is negligible when it sits inside a measurable set of measure 0, small enough that it never affects an integral. A property holds almost everywhere when it fails only on such a negligible set, and two functions are equal almost everywhere when they differ only there. The lemma that makes this practical is simple but essential. A countable union of negligible sets is still negligible, so we may disregard countably many exceptions at once. And here is the payoff the whole chapter has been building toward. There is one and only one measure on the real line that gives every interval its ordinary length. This is the Lebesgue measure. Single points have measure 0, and a striking consequence follows on the slide. The entire set of rational numbers is negligible, being a countable union of single points. The same construction extends to higher dimensions, where it assigns to each box its ordinary volume. The section closes with what singles out the Lebesgue measure among all others. The slide defines the relevant regularity notions, but the result to carry away is the characterization. A locally finite measure on Euclidean space is invariant under translation, if and only if it is the Lebesgue measure, up to a multiplicative constant. So translation invariance, the demand that size not change when a set is merely shifted, pins the Lebesgue measure down essentially uniquely. That is the deep reason it serves as the natural reference measure on Euclidean space. We have reached the end of the chapter's construction. Let us gather the main ideas and look at what comes next. Let us take stock. Over this chapter we built the entire foundation in 4 steps. Which sets can be measured? Which functions respect that structure? What a measure is and how to extend it? And finally the Lebesgue measure itself, singled out by translation invariance. What comes next follows naturally. With measurable spaces and measures now in hand, the next chapter constructs the Lebesgue integral on a general measure space. First for non-negative functions, then for integrable ones, together with the convergence theorems that give the integral its remarkable flexibility. A brief word on sources. The measure-theoretic material developed here follows classical lines, drawing on the standard treatments of Billingsley, Halmos and Cohn. For readers who want to see the same theory unfold in a directly probabilistic setting, the slide also points to the parallel treatments of Bremont. The material in this lecture is drawn from the book Measure Theory, Probability and Stochastic Processes, an Integrated Approach, where the full bibliography and all the precise references are collected. This course was prepared by Mohammed Kadem Kare. Thank you for your attention.